Welcome to the third installment of this fall's presidential lecture series. I am Henriette Löwisch, and I am the T. Anthony Pollner Professor at the University of Montana School of Journalism this fall. And when I was asked a few weeks ago to introduce this evening's speaker, the first thing I said was, but I don't know him personally. But since I've been thinking about that, and it has occurred to me that this wasn't true, after all. In fact, we did meet many years ago in Munich when I was a student at journalism school, and he taught a class in opinion writing. Now, opinion writing wasn't my strong suit at the time, which is probably why I tried as best I could to forget that encounter, and then went on to become a lowly wire service reporter, and which makes it entirely understandable that he doesn't remember me at all. We do have one thing in common, however. We both share a deep affection for our adopted part-time country, the United States. In fact, what makes Josef Joffe so unique is that his stellar career straddles two continents, and that fact alone gives great credibility to what he has to say. Josef Joffe is one of the most eminent thinkers in Europe today, and he certainly is Germany's most eminent Atlanticist. When we crossed paths back in Munich, he ran the editorial page of Süddeutsche Zeitung, Germany's largest subscription newspaper. It's New York Times, if you will. And he also served as that paper's foreign editor. In 2000, he became publisher-editor of Germany's venerable weekly newspaper, Die Zeit. Now, at the time, Die Zeit, though well respected, was mostly piling up unread under the kitchen tables of beleaguered high school teachers. And there's no offense meant here to anyone. But with Joffe at the helm, the paper experienced a renaissance. Younger reporters were brought in to win a younger and more diverse audience. And I don't know how he does it, but while putting his stamp on Die Zeit, he also pursued his career as a scholar on this side of the Atlantic. Having obtained his PhD from Harvard, he has taught there, as well as at Princeton, Dartmouth, and Johns Hopkins. He currently serves as an adjunct professor of political science at Stanford, and he is a fellow of the Hoover Institution. Josef Joffe has written numerous books, the latest published this June under the title Überpower, The Imperial Temptation in American Foreign Policy. He has weighed in on many crucial debates important to audiences in the United States as well as in Europe. He has contributed essays, reviews, and opinion pieces to quality US and British dailies. And he is a sought-after commentator and guest on television programs like the Lehrer News Hour on PBS. All of which means that being the wire service hack that I am, I presently feel a bit like the Black Rebel Motorcycle Club opening for the Rolling Stones. I want to extend my thanks to President Dennison for his support in bringing this top act to this campus. And thanks, of course, to Professor Drake, who is responsible for luring yet another distinguished speaker to this mountain town. I cannot think of anyone more qualified than Josef Joffe to give us some perspective on what to expect from Europe in the coming decades. So, without further ado, please help me welcome him to Missoula.
This introduction reminds me of an introduction by a German ambassador of Henry Kissinger at a conference in Princeton, and he said, here's a man who no man in the world needs an introduction less than Henry Kissinger. And then he proceeded to introduce him for about 20 minutes. But Henry was in a very good mood on that day, and so when he bestrode the stage, he said, it's true, no man needs an introduction less than I do, but nobody enjoys it more than I do. Before we came here, we had a very sumptuous meal at the president's house with more course than I can remember. So you know what happens when you eat too much? The juices flow down, and so it could happen that something could happen that never happened before in the history of public speaking, that the speaker falls asleep before the audience does. They understand you don't like Californians around here. They drive up the real estate prices. Well, I'm currently from California, from Stanford, and they say that California is the Golden State, but in my book, Montana is certainly the most beautiful state in the Union. It's been a kind of myth in my mind since I was a kid when I saw that Richard Widmark movie, Red Skies Over Montana or something. Those of you a bit older in the audience here know how long that reaches back. So at any rate, when I was invited to give this lecture by Professor Drake, I leapt at the occasion. He didn't have to lure very hard. And so here I'm here tonight to speak about a much more densely populated place than Montana, namely Europe, where after 150 years we are trying to make bears feel at home again. So far in Germany at least, the score has been civilization 1, bear zip, because early this year a young bear immediately christened Bruno Bear by the media, wandered over from Slovenia via Italy, no passport, no visa, cleverly evaded the authorities for many weeks, but in the end was callously shot in Bavaria on account of having slaughtered too many chickens and sheep. And I trust that the coexistence between bears and chicken farmers is a bit more stable around here. Today, with my topic, I feel a bit like Bruno Bear. Not that I would be shot, but I might be in the wrong movie. Because as far as media fashions go, the hot stuff right now is China. It's India. Like in the 80s when Japan was about to take over the world, or in the 1990s when Europe was all the rage, when the wall came down and Europe expanded from 15 to 25 members, and when 11 countries fused their various currencies into one, the euro. So Europe was to advance to the status of big global player in the same league as the US, as we know, the last remaining superpower. So where do we stand today? Let's begin with the obvious. I'm not stalling, I just want to put my watch up here. let's begin with the obvious. No matter how breathtaking the economic rise of China, there's only one player on the field able to hold its own against the United States, economically, that is. That's the European Union with a matching GDP of 12 trillion, it's about the same, and a population of 456 million, considerably more than the US. Yet, while economic clout is a necessary condition of superpower status, it's not a sufficient one. For all its huge potential, there are three problems in my book that stand between the EU and truly great power status. One is military, one is demographic, and one is cultural. Now, let's start with the military. First, the EU doesn't spend enough on defense. The two best performers are Britain and France, who spend around 2.5% of their GDP. During the Cold War, Britain, France, Germany, Italy spent between 3 and 5%. Today, the biggest country in the EU, Germany, spends as much as the tiniest, 1.5%. The next two middleweights, Italy and Spain, pay out 1.9 and 1.2, respectively. And altogether, Europe devotes less than 2% of domestic output to the military, which is half the American ratio, and about 1/2 of US spending in absolute terms. So the point here is Europe has cashed in on its peace dividend, and it likes it. So absent a new strategic threat, the EU will stick to its cozy post-Cold War posture, especially, and now we're getting to the demographic point, especially since the old gun versus butter dilemma has taken, will take on ever nastier edge. Outside Britain, which took the nasty medicine of microeconomic reform in the 80s, the large country of the EU have been battling with stubborn unemployment for about 15 years. If you actually measured it honestly and you put in all the subsidized jobs and the retraining, it's kind of stuck at the 12% level. And the reason is that the remedy prescribed by British Thatcherism has remained very hard to swallow for nations weaned on generous social protection. So growth is lagging behind the United States, and it's certainly lagging behind India and even Russia, and certainly behind China. So what about putting more national monies into the all-European kitty to finance a world-class strategic role? The problem here is that adding deficits doesn't a surplus make. And so the European Rapid Reaction Force, conceived 7 years ago, will not exceed 60,000 soldiers. Compare this to the US, which fielded 500,000 in the first Iraq War and 160,000 in the second Iraq War. The problem here is that the EU is buying modernization at the cost of mass shrinkage, and so shrinkage is the price of mobility and high-tech weaponry. That makes European armies more deployable than the tank-heavy forces of the Cold War. But if you, say, like Germany as a dramatic example, you reduce your tank force, your panzers, from 5,100 to 360, that doesn't leave much stuff to use in interventions abroad. So I think militarily, Europe is not going to push the US off its exalted perch. Now let's go to demography. Remember, it's the economy stupid, coined by the Clinton campaign, first Clinton campaign. And though Europe will eventually go through its reform process, do change its microeconomics, there is a more oppressive foe that lurks at Europe's door, and its name is depopulation and aging. If we use the UN definition of Europe, which happens to include Russia, Europe's population started to contract at the beginning of this millennium and will drop from 728 to 653 million in 2050. By that time, the US will number 400 million. The share of those over 65 years old will double. Now, unlike Russia, which is a very special case, EU-Europe doesn't have to deal with plunging life expectancy rates which are abysmal in Russia, kind of approaching 50 or so. But good health and longevity in Europe have turned into a bane when you relate them to sinking birth rates. And there is something truly astounding going on in Europe as we speak, or for the last several decades. As you know, that to keep a population constant, you have to have 2.1 children per woman of childbearing age. Only the United States and the West comes close to that rate, about 2.0. In the EU, of the 25, the fertility rate stands at 1.4. In Germany, it has fallen from 2.2 after the war to 1.3. The worst drop is in Italy, Catholic country, where the Pope tells you shouldn't use birth control. It doesn't help. The Italian rate is down to 1.2, and in a very rich part of Italy, Lombardy, it's down to an astounding 0.9 per woman. Only France doesn't fit into this pattern. They still have a reasonably high birth rate, and they certainly have a lot of immigration from North Africa, so France will grow slightly into mid-century. Now let's look at the United States. Here the population is growing at 1% per year, which doesn't sound so much, but if you start playing compound interest rates, it means that the population will double in 70 years and stand at 600 million in 2075. And this dynamic is due to a fertility rate which is almost at replacement, as I said, plus steady legal and illegal immigration. Now, but if you assume that the classic correlation between demographic growth and industrial and economic growth that we have observed since the 19th century, if that holds, then you can't escape the conclusion that this country will over time grow a lot faster than Europe. Why? Well, the older we get and the fewer people work, the more old people we have to support. Now, I know we have the same problem in this country too, but in Europe it's really dramatic. In 2050, each worker will have to support one non-worker. Today it's still 3 workers for 1 worker. And that's not the end of it. The higher the share of GDP that must go to the elderly, the less is left for investment, be it civilian or military. So as a result, Europe is bound to fall behind in the growth race, unless Europe manages to extract more workers from a shrinking population than it does right now. How do you do that? Not all is lost. There are 4 ways in which you can do it. 1, Europe manages to boost fertility. That is not quite easy to do in the medium run when so many long-term factors like late childbearing and high housing costs conspire against the Lord's injunction to Adam to be fruitful and multiply. 2, Europe could change its work-leisure balance by going for a longer work life. But while the weekly wages are creeping up, the de facto retirement age is stuck below 60. Whereas in this country, as you know, mandatory retirement is kind of disappearing from ever more professions. Apparently, and most of all, right here in the academy, where it started. Third, you can compensate for shrinking numbers by outstripping US productivity, which is, by the way, the same per hour worked in Europe as it is here, but not per worker, because, as you know, Americans are workaholics, and so they work about 300 hours more per year than their European colleagues. But productivity growth requires higher capital expenditures. How do you shift resources in democracies where the growing armies of the elderly will vote their economic interests, and that is for more support for consumptions? And finally, fourth and finally, Europe could boost its labor force participation rate, the share of the population that works, which is much lower there than in the United States, and which reflects both cultural choice and structural unemployment. So these four things could there is no destiny here, but these four things could compensate for the demographic dilemma that Europe is facing, but it would require a rewriting, as it were, of the social contract that so far has favored leisure over documented work. I emphasize the word documented because I think Europeans in the end work as hard as Americans, except a lot of work in Europe is done off the books because of a perverse tax structure that doesn't favor legal work. But if you look at the numbers of Home Depots all over Europe, I think there are more of them than here, so they must be working a lot on the side. Let me come to the third factor, which is perhaps the most interesting: culture. The problem here is that the European culture after World War II, in the 20th century, has changed in the sense that here's a continent that was once a continent of conquerors that roamed the farthest corners of the earth, among others discovering this country, is turning into a culture of post-prefixes. These are postmodern, post-national, post-sovereign, and post-heroic. It's not so funny. What is a post-culture, this post-culture mean? Well, if you want to catch up, become a global player like the US, it doesn't put you in a good competitive position, because though Europe is very rich in soft power, otherwise the EU wouldn't be such an attractive model where they're banging in the doors to get in, the Turks, the Ukrainians, etc. In the end, soft power can't do without hard power, because otherwise the papacy would still be a great power. Playing a global strategic role requires a national rather than a post-national mindset, and a single sovereign rather than 25 and soon 27 or even more. It isn't just a matter of forging an e pluribus unum. It demands the close fusion of state and sovereignty, nationhood and democracy. And that overlap is partial at best. The problem with the European state, the EU, is that it isn't the sovereign. It is kind of suspended between its incomplete powers and the battered prerogatives of its 25 members. So it lacks the clout of a real empire, and it lacks the legitimacy of the democratic nation state, which it has amassed in the time as it evolved by harnessing the consent of the governed to its national purposes. So the ultimate irony may well be that the EU, which is a haven of so many stable democracies, which is really quite breathtaking if you think about the anti-democratic future, past of Europe in the 20th century, something that has become a haven of so many stable democracies, liberal democracies, will end up with neither a state, nor a nation, nor a democracy. And why do I say that? Well, the biggest problem I think this EU construction has is that democracy, as the word says, democracy, it entails a demos, a nation or a community. Second, it requires a mechanism by which the ruled bestow their consent on their rulers. How does such a system work? Well, the core of such a system consists of election and of public debate. But Europe's rulers, representing the various governments, are not elected. I mean, Europe is governed by the Council of Ministers, which is composed of individual governments. They're not elected, and neither is the European public, nor European debate, nor are the European-wide media. The irony is that the only all-European media right now are US papers and networks like the International Herald Tribune or CNN that provide a European-wide forum. And so the virtual nature of this demos is reflected in low voter turnout. For instance, in the last elections to the European Parliament, only 39% of the Dutch and 43% of the French showed up at the polls. Now that's bad. That's as bad as voting in US midterm elections. The hallmark of any state, also of this European construction, is sovereignty. In a democratic state, sovereignty is lodged in the people, right? We the people. In the EU, sovereignty is located where? It's neither in the people nor in the parliament, where it should be. The parliament has very, very few powers compared to the US Congress. And the people can't even vote or elect their own leaders. As I said, they are the result of horse trading between governments. So in the history of the nation state, democratic nation state, there's never been anything like it. You might almost call this European polity post-democratic too, to add to the prefixes. So I think this post-democratic nature of the system has replaced the classical model, but strangely, that was not the target of revolutionary discontent for half a century. There was grumbling, but it came with a shrug and not with a balled fist. When a national referendum on a more perfect union was lost, as in Denmark in '92 or in Ireland in 2002, the referendum was repeated until the yeses prevailed. And of course the exception has always been Britain, the fiercest defender of sovereignty, nationhood, and ancient democratic habits. Now for 50 years, Europeans kind of, hey, that's nice, could you turn it up? Maybe that's mine. No. No more. 50 years into this wondrous process, the revolt against post-democracy finally did materialize. And those of you who have been reading the papers last year will recall that the real demos, the real people, that is the voters of two founding members, France and Holland, rejected by resounding margins what was billed as Europe's constitution that wasn't supposed to do a hell of a lot. It's just to shift a bit more powers from the states to the whole. And of course, in the aftermath, several other member states canceled their referenda, and since ratification requires unanimity among the 25, the largest leap ever into a more perfect union was frozen in time. I think the message last year was enough, at least for now. And in a strange way, democracy had asserted itself against post-democracy and the nation state against the superstate. And if you want to put this in American terms, it was like as if Virginia and Connecticut, two avid signers of the US Constitution in 1787, had turned against it with a vengeance in 1788. That's pretty much what France and Holland did. And France and Holland were asked to cede far less than any of the 13 original American states. They were not expected to lodge power in a popularly elected president, nor were they asked to let the Congress be the supreme lawgiver. They were not asked to yield citizenship to the United States of Europe, or to demote their national leaders to the modest status of a state governor in the US. It was just a bit more than in the past, a European foreign minister and a voting system in the European Council, the actual government, that allocated a bit more weight to the bigger states. And yet this little bit proved too much for more than 3/5 of the voters in the two key countries. So how will the EU assert itself in the world? During the heyday of the modern nation state, power, sovereignty, and consent all went together. Sovereignty, so to define the self of the nation, the vessel, so to speak. Patriotism and nationalism, still richly present in this country, filled that vessel with emotion, loyalty, and a sense of mission. And democracy added collective will to the mixture, a will that rendered power legitimate, and by the way, in the end, proved a lot stronger than totalitarian mobilization under Nazism and communism. So if, as I argue, the fusion of democracy, state, and nation are the stuff of self-assertion, the EU is badly equipped to bestride the world as a global actor. Now, because with its power so fragmented, the EU cannot make strategic decisions with, quote, decision, activity, secrecy, and dispatch, unquote, to recall the famous phrase by Alexander Hamilton when he argued in the Federalist Papers for a strong presidency. Europe can't even unleash a public debate on the why and wherefore of boosting defense spending or going to war, because, as I argued, there is no European-wide public, there's no European-wide agora, if you wish. And if there were, the language that once inspired sacrifice in the name of the nation would ring a bit hollow in 21st century Europe. And that's why I talked about the post-national and post-heroic. In a post-national society, the I has trumped the we, while self-fulfillment has pushed aside collective purpose. Now you will ask, how can you stick the post-national label onto nations that reasserted their nationhood in 2005 when they rejected the Constitution? And I will argue that it's imperative not to confuse the anti-constitutional revolt last year with the resurgence of traditional nationalism. The old version of European nationalism, I mean, the Europeans invented nationalism, was expansive, it was aggressive. But the nationalism that turned against Europe was defensive and inward bound. The battle cry was leave us alone, not let us forge ahead. The impulse was not to scale walls, but to draw them higher against whatever this Europe suddenly threatened. Less protection, more competition, more cheap labor from the East, and fewer jobs kept in the West. Yet this self-centered nationalism, more accurately anti-integrationism, is not the same as patriotism, love of country. So in that respect, Europe remains a post-patriotic space, with again Britain the exception that proves the rule. And let me give you some numbers this late in the evening. When Americans are queried on their attachment to the country, 95% respond very proud or quite proud. 95%. They're proud, very proud or quite proud to be an American. At least in the red states, I guess. Is this a red state or a blue state? Purple. We'll talk about it. In Europe, such admissions of national fealty drop dramatically. Highest on the very proud scale are the British with 54%. Spaniards, Scandinavians, Italians admit to high pride in the 40% range. And only, strangely enough, only 35% of Frenchmen say they are very proud. And when this next poll was taken before reunification, the West Germans came in lowest at 20%. So what is this? So this post-heroic state, what does this post-heroic state do? Well, the post-heroic European state does not intervene abroad in search of booty or glory or fame, but in the name of humanitarian duty. Preferably when there's no fighting, as in the 2005 East Asia tsunami disaster, or where US air power has broken the enemy's will, as it did with the bombing campaign against Serbia in 1999. Now, if you compare that to the 19th century, when the Europeans were about the most aggressive, martial, expansionist, nationalist race on earth, when competitive conquest drove European expansion, today I think Europeans are much more likely to look for glory in what I would call competitive compassion, which is intervene abroad for humanitarian duty. And so the fleets you send are unload blankets and not battalions. It is not the new power politics of Europe, is the politics of goodness. So the point here is that Europe's nationalism is defensive. And why? And I think it makes sense. Once the Soviet Union was off the chessboard, who's the enemy now? Well, I'll tell you who the enemy is. The enemy is other people. It is Bosnians or Kosovars who fled west to escape ethnic cleansing. It is North Africans who flee from misery and oppression. It's Central Africans who fear war and tribal butchery. It is it's Pakistanis and Bangladeshis who come for the menial jobs in Britain. It is Poles who repair the plumbing in Paris, and Ukrainians who go as far as Portugal to work the building sites in Lisbon. These are the new sub-strategic threats Europe faces. People of different color, faith, and culture who strain the coffers of the welfare state and batter tightly regulated labor markets. So a lot of even humanitarian intervention has a kind of hard-nosed purpose. It is to pacify, or at least quarantine, those areas from Africa to Afghanistan, whence war and famine propel the multitudes to Europe's shores. It's a kind of forward defense against the 21st century's poor and huddled masses. So here are some of the reasons why I don't think, 3 reasons: economics, demography, culture, why I don't think that the EU, this economic and demographic giant, will assume a global strategic role anytime soon. So what about the sub-strategic level? Let's call it globalization. How is Europe doing in globalization? That relentless force that has shrunk time and space by pushing transportation costs down and communication costs almost to zero. How will Europe deal, or how is Europe dealing with the flat world that Tom Friedman had celebrated? A world where, 1, age-old barriers to competition are crumbling, B, capital, goods, and people are traveling ever more freely at ever longer distances. Like me, I come from California. And 3, where technological advantages are very quickly diffused by imitation and migration, and where no nation can hold on to a technological advantage or invention for very long. Now, all Western Europes have problems with adaptation. And the interesting thing is that Europe is doing very, very well in one respect and not so well in another. It does not so well, as you might have surmised, when it comes to the movement of people. Like the US with Mexican and Latin Americans, the EU can't keep them out. But unlike the US, it has more trouble integrating, let alone assimilating them. Let me just give you one dramatic example. In the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of terrorism in Europe has been homegrown, exclusively homegrown. No sleepers, nobody flown in, like it was homegrown. In Madrid, in London, Amsterdam. But there's no homegrown terrorism in the US. You'll ask me, why? Well, I'm not going to give you the right-wing answer, which is, the Patriot Act and Homeland Security and people like Ashcroft. No. I have a different take on this. The Arab community here in the United States has done extremely well in terms of income and achievement. The Arab or Islamic community in the suburbs of Paris, Madrid, and Rome, or the Turks in Berlin, have not. Why so? My short answer is this. It is a lot easier to become an American than a German, Frenchman, or Spaniard. And it's a lot easier to rise if you are for foreigners in the United States. Last year, I gave 4 A's on my Stanford seminar. 3 of them to people called Drew, Kim, and Suraj Patel. All first generation, Indian, Chinese, and Korean. So Europe, for lots of reasons which we can go into discussion, doesn't make it quite as easy as the United States to come here and to make it. So that's where Europe is doing not so well. But paradoxically, Europe is doing quite well, very well, on the 2 other levels of globalization, on the movement of capital and goods. Now look at German or French business, which are globalizing with the best of them. Together with the Japanese and the Koreans, German cars are giving Detroit a very hard time. You've seen those endless ads by T-Mobile, at least in the New York Times. I don't know about here. No, they wouldn't be here because I just realized my T-Mobile doesn't work here. But that's a German company, and one that used to be a government-run monopoly not a long time ago, which is spanning the United States with its mobile telephone networks and data transmission. Airbus, this Franco-German construction, had almost overtaken Boeing until it ran into stiff headwinds with its super jumbo A380. Altogether, I would argue EU industries have used the last 10 years to downsize, restructure, expand, and become frightfully efficient. Not at all like what our normal image of this kind of tired, state-regulated European economy is. And why? Because of China? Because of India? Because of Vietnam, Malaysia? And my surprising answer is no, Europe has done so well because of Europe. Why? Well, Europe's China in quotation marks, consists of 2 parts. One part is called Brussels, the other one is called Eastern Europe, or as Don Rumsfeld used to call it, New Europe. Let's talk a bit about Brussels. Maggie Thatcher, who always hated the EU Commission, denouncing them as Eurocrats, actually should have loved them. Why? Because no other force has better and more insistently prepared Europe for reform and globalization than has the EU Commission. How so? In one directive after another, the EU has torn down competitive barriers within Europe, forcing governments to privatize airlines, to privatize telecoms, to privatize utilities, to open the capital markets to cross-border competition between banks and insurance companies. Without the Commission, back in Hamburg where I live, I might still have to deal with black rotary phones rented from the National Post Office and paying about $3 for a call across the Atlantic per minute. Today, I swear, it's cheaper to make a call from Hamburg to Missoula than the other way around. So the EU has relentlessly leveled the playing field, forcing adaptation, forcing technological change. So Brussels is one name for China as a competitive force. The other name is Eastern Europe. The newcomers are even worse than China, because that China isn't 5,000 miles away, but right next door. It's Estonia, it's Hungary, it's Poland, it's Czechia. And I call them China because they are like China. They are low-wage, high-productivity countries. The cost of labor in Poland is 1/6 of the hourly rate in Germany. And you don't even have to learn Chinese. The older ones still speak German, and the young ones all speak English. So big business in the various European states, for decades, very nicely sheltered from competition, has been forced to downsize and restructure, to offshore and to outsource, to keep their wage bill down. That's how European business can afford those very high wages inside of Europe, because it's been exporting large pieces of the value chain to our China next door, and thus keeping payroll costs down on average level. So I think that today, strangely enough, BMW and Audi are a lot meaner and leaner than GM and Ford. Ford, which has just announced a write-off of almost $6 billion. So I think that economically, Europe is doing extremely well in the globalizing game. So where are the problems? On the political social level. Remember that this astoundingly effective European welfare state after World War II depended on closed borders. Closed, of course, not against goods, because European economies are a lot more trade intensive than the American one is, about 3 times more. But closed above all in terms of national regulation, which curtailed competition, preserved market privileges of favorite players, and created lots of cozy protected niches. That, no wonder, has slowed down adaptation. Above all, the transition to what the globalized world is mainly about, from an industrial into a service economy, which can respond so much more quickly to shifts in demand and create a lot more jobs more swiftly. Just give me an example. Manufacturing in the US is down to about 16% of GDP. In Germany and France, it's still around almost 30%. So these economies carry a lot of the old baggage. They're stuck in a mode which are particularly vulnerable to low-wage competition, whereas services are somewhat less vulnerable, and certainly you can create jobs much more quickly in the service economy than in the contracting manufacturing economy. So the US has been a lot more, I think for cultural and for historical reasons, the US has been much more successful at this game. For as a German economics minister explained about 10 years ago, said here in Germany we could never have had Microsoft or Hewlett Packard or Google, because the law in Germany makes it illegal to use garages for any other purposes than housing a car. That's a true quote. And it's true. We couldn't have, no way Hewlett-Packard could have started in a Munich garage. Somebody would have pressed charges against them. I'll give you another example. It takes one afternoon and a few pounds sterling in Britain to start up a private limited liability company, but several thousand euros in several weeks to do so in Germany, not to speak of Italy or France. So you get the point. It does stifle initiative and transformation a bit. The point of such tales is that the European social contract doesn't favor change. It favors producers over consumers, guilds and trade associations over entrepreneurs, and above all, it favors the is over the might be. And of course, the reasons are perfectly understandable. No continent, no place in the world has suffered so much cataclysmic change in the first part of the 20th century than has Europe. Revolutions, 2 world wars which killed millions of people, the young, the next generation, hyperinflation, devaluation, tens of millions of people being expelled or fleeing from their native lands. So Europe has kind of written an unwritten social contract for itself, which consists of 2 articles. 1, nothing must change. 2, if change is absolutely unavoidable, losers must be amply compensated rather than being forced into adaptation. And I think it's this cultural, this mindset that makes it quite difficult in Europe to deal with technological and scientific change such as stem cell research or genetically modified foods. A culture that has experienced so much uncertainty in the past is not very fond of the kind of uncertainty new technologies involve for the future. And so no wonder that Europe's major biochemicals have transferred most of their research to the United States, and more of them will come when the next president will loosen stem cell research barriers as well. Now, in conclusion, to the best news. All of this that I've told you is changing. It has to change. You can't stand still in that fast-moving world. The only issue is how quickly. Take Germany, as far as change is concerned. The highest tax bracket has come down from 53% to 43%. Corporation taxes are down to 25%. That's a Republican dream. And why? Because capital doesn't have a passport anymore. It will go where profits are highest and taxes are lowest. And suddenly, old Europe, the big countries, have to compete with the dwarfs of New Europe, Estonia, for instance, or Poland, not only on wages, but also on taxes. That's what globalization is all about. Falling borders, a flat world. Globalization, culturally speaking, is also one huge demonstration effect, which is what sociologists use when they want to avoid a normative term-like model. The almost instantaneous diffusion of knowledge, which was never the case in centuries past. So a young European can ask his government, hey, why do I have to apprentice myself for 3 years, then become a journeyman, then after more years pass exams to make master craftsman, which only then allows me to open up a barber shop. I can open a barber shop in XYZ whenever I want to. This demonstration effect of endless examples does force governments and cultures to come to grips with change that can be slowed down but not really staved off. So, in conclusion, this Europe, which we tend to associate with lush green valleys, medieval castles, and rowdy beer gardens, is changing at a rapid clip. In some technologies, say cell phones above all, it has overtaken the United States. If you think of Nokia, which is a Finnish company, it's not a California company. So the upshot is this. 1, a strategic actor rivaling the United States, Europe will not be, not soon. 2, a young continent with a growing non-aging population, Europe won't be either. 3rd, an e pluribus unum, a United States of Europe, this continent will not be in our lifetime. It was just a lot easier to get Massachusetts and Virginia into a more perfect union than it is to get Portugal and Poland into one. 4, nor will Europe be a place soon which can deal more successfully with immigration. That's a lot easier, as I argued, in the United States, where everybody is from somewhere else, and where your passport matters less than where you got your degree in electrical engineering, and where labor markets are so much more flexible, and where there has never been a state religion, only a kind of American creed to which no matter where you come from, anybody can sign on. But, 5th, Europe as a kind of huge Disneyland full of Brother Grimm motifs, a rest and recreation area for nouveau riche Chinese and Indians, never. Think about IKEA, Swedish, think about Nokia, Finnish, think about Trader Joe's. Is Trader Joe's penetrated to Montana yet? No? Well, it will. It's a German-owned grocery chain that is spreading across the US and opening a new store almost every day. California is already saturated by Trader Joe's. Perfectly American name, German chain. Think about, in general, 450 million highly educated people with a superb infrastructure and stable democracies. And 6, and finally, think about Europe not as a threat, but as a boon. Just think about America's trade relationship with Europe. It's the only trade relationship America has that is balanced, evenly balanced between imports and exports. And that distinguishes it a bit from the Chinese trading relationship. Plus, when you think about Europe, think about it, in the end, Europe and the United States share a lot more political and cultural interest than either of them with China or India. And that why, final conclusion, I am so happy that the bitter resentments during the Iraq War, after those bitter resentments, 2002 and 2003, freedom fries have again become French fries. Just keep those Europeans out of Montana so that I can keep coming back here to enjoy the grizzlies in the big skies. Thank you.
Can you call the questions yourself, or do you want me to?
I can't see these people.
Okay. Josef Joffe is going to be happy to take your questions, and it would be good, because we have a hard time seeing from here because of the, if you could go up to the microphones and also say maybe a little bit about who you are, yeah?
It's very tricky for a speaker to recognize people in the audience he doesn't know. I have to tell you another Kissinger story. We had organized a student conference in '73 in Washington. We'd just been made Foreign Secretary of State, and he came in and said, you know, I don't have a prepared speech, so why don't we do Q&As? So the kid, one of my co-organizers, an extremely stupid kid, said to the secretary, okay, then you run the meeting. So 10 hands shoot up. He picks the guy in the yellow shirt, whom none of us would have picked, because the kid gets up and says, Dr. Kissinger, do you consider yourself to be a war criminal? Kissinger turns around and was gone before we could even get up out of our seats. So remember that story.
should I be the first to find? To stay within the bare metaphor that you open up with your doctor and that we all appreciate here in Montana. Don't take what I mean to say as pepper spray, just as bewildered comments coming from an American and a European citizen. I consider myself as an Euro-American or Americano-European, meaning that I see where you come from as an Atlanticist, thank you, if you may allow me to say that. But, so I don't know if it's really comments or if it's your question, but I'm bewildered by, first, the way you approach the future of the world with the concept as global power, strategic blocks, which to me and to others seems to be a bit passé, if you allow me to say that. And as you pointed very well, masterly, the contradiction of the European Union, when Europe will be the first to speak about that themselves, as you know. But also, as one of the main problems is that you seem to take for granted that the American model is the only one possible. As you know, there's ideology at stake. Europeans have still a lot of post-communists, I know you don't like the word post, post-socialist, and refuse what is entailed or what the American development means. So it seems to me your approach is a bit too unilateral, but perhaps in the world of next century there'll be multipolar, there'll be no strategic power as such. So I just want to let you answer that. Thank you.
I think the question is whether I'm guilty of defining the United States as the only possible model. I hope I haven't done that, because there is no such thing as the only possible model for a bunch of societies and cultures so diverse as is Europe. What I did say was, and I think it can be argued, is that the model of the way America deals with immigration in conjunction with flexible labor markets and in conjunction with a postmodern society that has shifted from manufacture to services is better positioned to integrate foreigners, especially since it's so much easier, I think, to become an American than a Frenchman or a German. I mean, what would a Turk do in Germany or in Moroccan in Italy if you wanted to prove that he's a German, he's becoming German or an Italian? Well, there's so many nice ways in America. You start out by going to baseball games. Then you acquire the American cultural habit of shopping till dropping. Then you get a Costco card. Then you join the PTA. Then you put a flag out on 4th of July. So there's so many easy rituals that you can use to say, I'm one of you guys. Just on an anecdotal level, when the Turks started flocking in as guest workers to Germany, they all realized that the Germans their colleagues were all smoking a certain German cigarette called HB. So they figured, we all smoke HB cigarettes. Their German colleagues noticed, and they all switched to Marlboro. So I think there is more opportunity, there's faster opportunity, and I think with the appropriate skill and hard work, it's easier in this country to make the rest of them forget that you are just off the boat or just off the Boeing 747. And that, I think, is still harder in Europe, and I think that's what we'll have to work on. And Europe, by the way, is changing its citizenship conception. Basically, in Europe, you couldn't become a German or Italian. You had to have German or Italian parents. And there's now a spate of citizenship laws being reformed, which at last, after decades, makes it a lot easier to become, at least in Germany, to become a German if you were born there, for instance. So again, change is in the offing, but it's slow. But is there another model? Is America a model for the rest of the world? I don't think the rest of the world will ever take to baseball.
Go ahead, on the left there.
Is this on?
Yes?
Yeah, my name is Christian Johnson. I'm a liberal studies senior, and you made this statement that there are no homegrown terrorists from America. That's one of the good things we're doing, and I'm just curious how you would classify people like Ted Kaczynski or Timothy McVeigh.
Yeah, but I mean, you know what I meant to say. I meant to say I was comparing it to the kind of homegrown terrorism in Europe that comes from the Islamic world. Of course, there's Ted Kaczynski and Timothy McVeigh, but I was talking about a different kind of terrorism. And again, I think it's. I just have to point to the fact that there is no Arab terrorism here, period. And we have to ask ourselves why. I gave one possible answer. On the other hand, it's a lot easier to get explosives in this country. Or a gun.
You want to go?
Yeah, I'll give it a shot. I got 3 humdingers for you. Number 1, can I have a copy of your book?
What?
And number 2, how much do you think the 5-course meal you had cost the taxpayers of my fine state? And 3, why does Europe, and especially France, continue to insist upon putting its pro-like ghetto or immigrants into ghettos?
I have to beg your pardon. I didn't acoustically get the first 2 questions. Can you just slow?
They were just jokes.
But I want to hear the joke. Come on. Oh, come on, please. Okay? So the last question I think I got was, how long did I get it right when you said how long will Europe put its immigrants in the ghetto?
Why does Europe continue to insist upon putting its pro-like immigrants into the ghetto? Especially France.
Well, look, immigrants in general tend to congregate in ghettos. I don't think they're being put in ghettos. And you know, ghettos do have a function for newcomers. They do serve as protective environments. And all of American immigration in the 19th and 20th century has kind of passed through the ghetto. Look at all these movies that are made about the Lower East Side or about Chinatown. The trick is to make it easier to get out. And I think there are more ladders standing around in American ghettos than in European ghettos, which you can use to scale the walls. I see them in my class. I had a kid last year who was in Peru, escaped with his parents from the civil war in Peru. He says, "Where do you live now?" He says, "I live in Greenwich, Connecticut." "Oh wow, your father really must have made it." "No, he's still driving a limousine." "So how'd you get to Stanford?" "Scholarship." And that single word explains a lot, because I don't think we go out there in Europe and pluck gifted immigrant kids out of the ghetto and bring into something called Stanford. Not even to the next state university. And again, that's where America seems to work a bit faster. But we're starting to do that, by the way.
Phone's really short.
Was it a question?
No, it is really short. It's a statement.
Okay, if it's short, be slow.
Okay. My name's Tom Tard. I'm a student here. I have 2 questions. My first question is pretty basic. What do you think would benefit the United States more? Europe or the European Union as a really close competitor, or as somebody who's lagging far behind in military and economy? And my second question is, with basically the absence of the Soviet Union as a collective enemy for Europe, do you think that Europe has a collective enemy, real or imagined? And if so, even if they did, do you think that an attack in one section of Europe can really affect it as a whole, and therefore warrant them to like take military action as a community ever? I mean, do you see that ever happening?
Okay. First of all, the first question is a kind of normative question. I think I can answer it. Being a dyed-in-the-wool capitalist and neoliberal, I'd say, of course, a competitive Europe, certainly economically, is better for the United States because competition improves business and gets lazy folks off their behind. It doesn't quite seem to work on the automotive sector in this country, but in other respects it works. I mean, Boeing has gotten a real good run for its money by Airbus, and Boeing is now much better, much meaner, leaner, and an imaginative company than it was maybe 20 years ago. So competition is always good for both sides. Will Europe respond collectively to a military threat? Is that the answer? The question?
Yeah, the first part of the question was, do they have a collective enemy? Is everybody?
No, I mean I don't think that the Soviet Union is gone, and the blessing or the problem of the Europe is that there's no longer a strategic threat, and that explains what some of the things I've said. How defense budgets have gone down, and how and this strong unwillingness to think in more strategic or military terms. But Europe has in a way responded already militarily to what it defined as a collective threat, and that was the war of the Yugoslav succession, if you wish, that broke out in the Balkans in the early 90s. So in the end, NATO got into its planes and started and bombed Belgrade into submission. The problem with this analysis is that the Europeans wouldn't have done it if the US hadn't taken the lead. So I'm not sure whether Europe can, and that's what I argued in the first part of my talk, can accept and assume a strategic role for all the reasons I mentioned. It's not a state. It is a bunch of states without a collective will and also a collective sense of purpose or even threat. I think even in the Balkan scenario, the neighboring countries like Germany or Italy felt much more threatened by the Bosnian War because they had to take the brunt of the refugees, whereas Portugal naturally felt less affected, and Iceland didn't feel affected at all. By the way, Iceland has the highest birth rate in the world, I think, in the Western world. In the Western world. They have only 200,000.
Go ahead, on the right.
I'd like to turn to a political literary topic
and
ask you if you could please comment on the recent revelation by Günter Grass that he had served in the Waffen-SS, and I was particularly interested in the reaction in Germany as a whole, and then your personal reaction to that.
Okay. Well, let me give you a market-based answer. It hasn't hurt Günter Grass at all. It pushed books like nothing else could have pushed that book, his memoir. So he's hurting all the way to the bank. The debate, certainly in Germany, was quite vivid, quite dramatic, and in general, I think people were extremely disappointed in a man who had kind of assumed for himself the role of moral Pontifex Maximus. Günter Grass was always very quick in attacking and denigrating the moral posture of others, especially those suspected of a Nazi past. So it's almost a kind of a biblical story. He who throws the first stone, all that. I personally, how should I put this in academic terms? Well, I never liked the high moral horse that Günter Grass was on. But the interesting thing about this is, as I said, he's herding all the way to the bank. So in our postmodern age, even moral failure can be very profitable. Is it okay as an answer?
Go ahead, on the left side.
Early in your remarks this evening, you lamented the declining population reproduction rates in Europe and to a lesser extent in the United States. When I pay attention to what's going on in the world, I hear a lot lately about running up against natural limits, whether it be clean water or availability of the world to feed an expanding population, or even declining petroleum or natural gas resources. And for someone like yourself who spends a lot of time thinking about future trends and projecting into the future, I wondered if you could say a few words to reconcile the concerns about declining birth rates with the opposing concerns of increasing population.
That's a good question, but there is enormous strain on natural resources, but it's very heavily concentrated. I mean, first in the United States, the strain is mainly on the two coasts. 50, 100 miles on either side doesn't seem to strain a lot. I mean, Montana doesn't seem to be greatly strained by it, or any of the western states. Second point is that the kind of Malthusian predictions about population growth overwhelming resource growth has just been consistently wrong. And just if you look at the exponential growth in per acre yield of cereals, exponential, not percentage-wise. In the last 50 years, I have no problem feeding even a growing world population. The problem is getting it there and making sure that everybody gets a share. So I'm more worried about distribution than about production. And third, I think one of the nice things about human beings is that they don't react like bacteria or protozoa. They're sentient beings, and they can define, and deal with problems. And so, look what happens when energy goes up the way it has gone up in the last half year. Suddenly, the world is aflush with ideas how to relieve dependence on fossil energy. So I'm quite confident that this strange human race will deal with these problems. I'd rather have it deal with these problems than the kind of problems we had in the 20th century, which was depopulation by world war and revolution and famine. I mean, Stalin killed 20 million people just by famine. So I think I'd rather have today's problems than the problems of the 20th century.
Go ahead.
I'm Rob Cheney. I'm a reporter, but today I'm just representing American self-interest. What's in it for the United States to encourage or even tolerate a united Europe? And conversely, what's in it? What would Europe, as a European Union, suggest to the United States that it is to their advantage, rather than being a group of disorganized and divided and conquered smaller states that we can't benefit from individually?
Well, if you like the kind of bear in the chicken coop analogy, then the United States should work hard to not to encourage or tolerate European integration, but to demolish it. Look, in that kind of logic, of course, you'd rather face a bunch of little chickens than a whole united coop. But I say you can still sleep reasonably well because that chicken coop will still consist of lots of chickens. I mean, smaller animals because they will not so soon coagulate into a truly United States of Europe. So I would kind of phrase the American interest question a bit differently. I mean, if you live in the United States, who does one have to hang out with? With whom does one feel kinship, a sense of common culture, common language? It's Europe, isn't it? One can buy great stuff from Japan and China and Latin America, but in the end, this is still a European, mainly British, rather than continental European civilization. And I think it's no fun to hang out in the world where you have to worry about dividing the opposition all the time. And I think in Americans all the public opinion polls that I know is Americans like when it comes to military action abroad, they like being with others. They like having the assurance through the consent of others that what they're doing is right. So I would, if I had to advise American presidents or the Congress, I'd say, yeah, there's an ornery bunch of people and they give you a hard time and they kick shins every once in a while. But who else do we got? Maybe I'm a bit horribly Eurocentric, forgive me.
Shall we just one more question?
Whatever.
Okay, well, why don't you go and then maybe you and then we stop. Okay.
Ask me an easy one.
My name is Patrick Lynn. I'm reading history here at U of M. I've heard American consumer culture, the globalization of American consumer culture, described as an oil stain on a white linen tablecloth on the historical European culture that was described by Henry James when there was more there in Europe in past generations. Is American consumer culture that's epitomized in the globalization that proponents of it say will strengthen the European Union, is that an impediment to culture? And is globalization soulless?
If I may say so, you kind of loaded the question a bit. And you talked about consumer culture. When my European friends give me that kind of line of reasoning, I say, yeah, it's true that the world dresses, eats, drinks, listens, watches American. But there's a bit more to American culture than what you and they call consumer culture. There's more to America than shop till you drop. By the way, that has become a European habit too. We have Costco's by now in America too, in Europe too. I mean, I know the James critique was a 19th century critique when the U.S. was still a very derivative culture, if you so wish, a very European culture, and imitated Europe in furniture, literature, etc. But to me, American culture today is a hell of a lot more complex than McDonald's and Madonna. There is Microsoft, there is Harvard, there's the Met, there's the Metropolitan Opera, there's some of the best orchestras in the world. The best and largest libraries happen to be here. The best universities in the world, according to whatever survey you take, are here. The ratio of books, American books translated in Europe and vice versa is about probably 8 to 1. And it's not just the South Beach diet. And the best line, the best anecdote I have here, I remember a few years ago I was having a heated argument with a left-wing German parliamentarian who was kind of giving me the usual diatribe against the United States and its lack of this and lack of that. And suddenly he stopped and said, "Wait a minute, you went to Harvard, didn't you?" I said, "Yes, why? Could you help get my daughter in?"
All right, last question, please, Angela.
My name is Christian Rivera, and I guess my question would be, well, with the increasing value of the euro, do you believe that the negative European rhetoric has contributed to a lower economic base in Europe for Americans?
I'm not sure I understand the question. The rising Europe and
the economy of European the European nations as a whole has been pretty strong. So the euro has gained more value than the dollar, right?
I think the premise may be off here. I mean, don't ask me to explain currency movements. If I could, I'd be very rich by now. But look, there's some funny things in the currency market. Sometimes it is much more rapid growth, as in the United States, which is growing twice as fast as the European economy, which may drive down the value of the U.S. currency, on expectation that growth means inflation, and therefore drive down the value of the purchasing power of the currency, and so therefore traders are hedging. Strange, because the Dow Jones is above, or was, when I was last looking, above 1200. So they may be worried in Europe that the Fed will finally kind of hit the brakes, slam the brakes, raise interest rates, throttle growth, and therefore European investments will bring less profit than expected. So that is, I don't think, not the issue. And also, there are other forces driving the value of the American dollar. It has to do with the size of the deficit in part. It has to do with the twin deficit, the external and the internal. But I think the way you phrased the question, that's probably. Can we ask an economist in this audience to explain currency movements? I last failed that in my economics exam.
Well, maybe Richard Drake can get a currency expert here next.
Is there a currency expert in the room? No? Okay.
Okay. Yeah.